When I open a cold case file, I do not start with the name everyone knows now. That would be too easy. Names arrive at the end of an investigation, after the paper, after the maps, after the phone calls, after the evidence has been handled by more hands than anyone can count. So I start where the investigators had to start, with places. A map like this does not tell you what the first police report felt like. It makes everything look connected, because we already know the ending. That is a trap. In real time, Visalia did not automatically explain Sacramento. Sacramento did not automatically explain Goleta, Ventura, Dana Point, or Irvine. Each place had its own frightened witnesses, its own officers, its own reports, and its own pressure to solve the crime in front of them. Cold case work asks the investigator to do two things at once: respect each case as its own event, and still look for the pattern that may live above all of them. If you force the pattern too early, you may connect crimes that do not belong together. If you resist the pattern too long, the offender keeps moving while the files stay separated. The first map is California, but not the California of postcards. This one is marked by counties, suburbs, river corridors, old orchards, bedroom communities, freeway distance, and police jurisdictions that did not always know they were looking at the same man. Visalia, Sacramento, Contra Costa, Santa Barbara, Ventura, Orange County. Separate places on paper, separate names in the newspapers, separate fear in each community. Years later, the public would know him as the Golden State Killer. Before that, the file had other labels: Visalia Ransacker, East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker. Each name belonged to a different phase of the same long shadow, and each name also shows the problem. Investigators were not chasing a legend. They were chasing patterns that did not yet agree with one another. A burglary is not always only a burglary. In Visalia, in the mid-1970s, the pattern had a kind of patience to it. Homes entered, small items taken. Drawers disturbed, women's clothing moved. Ordinary rooms made strange by someone who appeared to study the inside of a house more carefully than a thief looking only for money. To an investigator, that kind of behavior changes the temperature of a file. It suggests preparation. It suggests practice. It suggests a man learning roots, doors, habits, and fear. In a burglary file, the stolen objects often tell you what kind of offender you are looking at. Some offenders take what can be sold quickly. Some take cash and leave almost everything else alone. The ransacker pattern was more unsettling because the disturbance itself seemed to matter. Rooms were entered and studied. Personal spaces were handled. The result was not only loss but intrusion, the sense that the offender had been inside a life rather than merely inside a house. That kind of behavior makes investigators slow down. A prowler who returns to neighborhoods, learns how people live, and takes small personal items may be rehearsing something that is not yet visible. No one can prove the next phase from the first break-in, but a careful detective notices when a thief appears to be practicing control instead of simply taking property. The name attached to that phase was the Visalia Ransacker. At first, it could be held inside the logic of burglary and prowling. That mattered. If police had known from the beginning that the same path might lead to serial rape and murder, every incident would have looked different. But detectives do not get to investigate future knowledge. They get the report in front of them, the house that was entered, the witness who saw only part of a figure, the footprint, the stolen object, the open door. The Visalia phase also forced police to think about risk in a new way. A burglar who avoids confrontation is one kind of offender. A prowler who is willing to confront a household is another. When a case begins with stealth and moves toward violence, investigators have to ask whether the escalation was sudden or whether the earlier crimes had always contained that possibility. The answer matters because escalation changes urgency. It means the pattern is no longer only about houses entered after dark. It is about an offender testing limits, learning from each risk, and discovering how much he can control without being caught. Then Claude Snelling was killed in 1975. That death changed the weight of the Central Valley file. A prowler had moved into a level of violence that no longer allowed anyone to treat the earlier pattern as simple nuisance or theft. Still, even then, the larger shape did not reveal itself. The man who would later be known across California had not yet been given that final name. What makes the case so difficult is that the offender seemed to understand ordinary suburban space. He did not need a haunted alley or a remote road. He used backyards, fences, canals, side paths, sliding doors, windows, and the predictable rhythms of people who believed their own homes were private. He learned neighborhoods as if they were diagrams. For police, that meant the crime scene was not only one house. It was the route into it, the route away from it, and the rehearsal that may have happened before anyone knew a crime was coming. By 1976, the fear had shifted north into the Sacramento area. The East Area Rapist name came from geography first, the Eastern District of Sacramento County, where a series of attacks began. The label was cold and procedural. It told people where the danger seemed to be. It did not tell them who he was, why he moved the way he did, or how long he had already been practicing. The East Area attacks produced another kind of evidence. Community behavior. Residents adjusted their routines. Some people checked windows more than once. Some slept lightly. Some watched the canal paths and side streets with new suspicion. Police warnings moved from official briefings into kitchens and living rooms. Fear became part of the geography. For investigators, that public fear created both help and burden. The same community that might provide a lead could also produce hundreds of reports that had to be checked. A strange car, a man walking too slowly, a noise near a fence, a neighbor who did not fit the block. Each could be meaningless. And each could be the missed detail everyone would regret later. In those neighborhoods, the file becomes almost unbearable in its ordinary details. Porch lights, back fences, telephones, dogs barking at the wrong hour, couples checking locks and still not feeling safe, police advice passed from house to house, people sleeping differently because a stranger had turned the architecture of suburbia against them. I use careful language here because the crimes were sexual assaults, and because the violence does not need graphic retelling to be understood. What matters for the investigation is the method. The offender stalked. He entered homes. He controlled victims through threats. He took items. He used fear as part of the crime and as part of the aftermath. The FBI later described a series involving dozens of rapes, homicides, and more than 100 residential burglaries across California. The scale was not visible at once. It accumulated. Public fear changed the work. A detective can follow evidence. A community follows rumor, warnings, newspaper language, and whatever advice seems practical enough to survive the night. In Sacramento, people bought locks, talked about dogs, watched strangers, and listened for sounds that might have been ordinary before. The East Area Rapist gave them meaning. A neighborhood meeting could become part of the investigation because public knowledge might produce a lead. It could also produce panic. That balance is hard to hold. Publicity can help identify patterns. It can bring witnesses forward. It can remind one resident of a man near a canal or another of a suspicious car. But publicity can also teach false confessors the vocabulary of a case. It can make ordinary men look sinister. It can flood a file with fear-shaped reports that must be checked one by one. There was also the problem of preparation. The offender seemed to know how to move before and after an attack. He appeared to use areas behind homes, open land, and neighborhood layouts. In some accounts, he watched houses before entering. That meant investigators were not only looking for a man after an incident. They had to think backward into the days or weeks before it. Who had been near the house? Who had been looking through windows? Who had tested doors? Who had learned the routine? That is a different kind of search. It turns the neighborhood itself into a pre-crime scene. The relevant witness may not have seen the attack. He may have seen a man near a canal 3 nights earlier, or a bicycle in a place where it did not belong, or a screen that looked slightly moved before anyone understood why that mattered. The offender knew how to leave behind uncertainty. In many accounts, he made phone calls. He appeared to study homes. He sometimes took small items that meant more to the victim than to a pawn shop. Those details mattered not because they made him theatrical, but because they showed control. He was not only committing crimes, he was entering the mental life of the people and neighborhoods he targeted. The series structure also affected survivor interviews. Investigators had to listen for details that were deeply personal and frightening while also comparing method. How did the offender enter? What did he say? What did he touch? What did he take? Which threats repeated? Which movements showed planning? The work demanded care because survivors were not just sources of data. They were people who had already been forced through the worst night of their lives. A bad interview can damage both a person and a case. A careful one can preserve details that later become vital. In a long series, small repeated actions can tell investigators that 2 scenes belong to the same offender. But those details have to be gathered without turning the survivor into a machine for evidence. For the officers working the case, every attack had to be handled as one event and as part of a possible series. That is more difficult than it sounds. One scene gives you physical evidence, statements, time, point of entry, point of exit, and the condition of the house. A series asks for something larger. Which details repeat? Which details change? Which details are meaningful and which are only coincidence? Before modern linked databases, jurisdictions could become walls even when no one wanted them to be. A sheriff's office might recognize its own pattern. A city police department might recognize another. A district attorney's office might focus on the charges it could prove within its county. The offender, meanwhile, did not have to respect those boundaries. He could move across them while the paperwork lagged behind. That lag is one of the case's central mechanics. The facts were not invisible, they were separated. One county held a method, another held a victim statement. Another held a murder scene, another held biological evidence. The larger pattern had to be built from separate rooms that did not always share the same filing system. County lines made that harder. In the 1970s, information did not move the way it moves now. No one could search a statewide digital record from a patrol car. There were no neighborhood doorbell cameras, no cell phone location trails, and no modern DNA database waiting to compare samples across counties. Reports moved through phone calls, paper, meetings, and professional memory. A detective in one jurisdiction might see a pattern clearly only after another jurisdiction had already lived through its own part of it. The Maggiore murders also changed the emotional weather of the investigation. A community already living with the East Area Rapist now had to consider that the same offender may have killed a young couple in the open, after a confrontation away from the controlled setting of a home invasion. The fear was no longer contained behind bedroom doors. It could spill into a walk with a dog, a neighborhood street, an ordinary evening. For detectives, that kind of event can either clarify or confuse. It may reveal the offender under pressure, acting when surprised. It may also create a scene with fewer of the ritualized details that connect to earlier attacks. The question becomes whether proximity, timing, eyeing, and behavior are enough to link the cases, or whether investigators are being pulled by the gravity of fear. The Brian and Katie Maggiore murders in 1978 shifted the Sacramento file again. They were a young married couple walking their dog in Rancho Cordova. Their deaths pulled the East Area Rapist case into a more dangerous frame because investigators saw a possible connection between the sexual assault series and homicide. If the same man was responsible, then the file had escalated in a way that changed every previous assumption. That is one of the coldest moments in an investigation. The possibility that the man you were chasing was more dangerous than the label you had given him. A label can lag behind the offender. The paperwork calls him one thing, while the evidence is already becoming another. The movement south is one reason the case stayed difficult for so long. If a series remains in one tight area, investigators can saturate it. They can watch neighborhoods, compare local suspects, and narrow opportunity. When the pattern moves across California, the offender's life becomes harder to place. Was he traveling for work, moving residences, choosing areas he already knew, returning to old familiar places? Or had investigators connected only after the map was already too wide? The Southern California phase, later associated with the original Night Stalker, forced investigators to ask whether the same offender had changed not only location, but also behavior. The stakes had become homicide. The scenes carried old echoes and new violence. The pattern was familiar enough to matter and different enough to delay certainty. After Sacramento, the map does not stop. It moves. The attacks extended across Northern California, and then the murders associated with the original Night Stalker appeared in Southern California. The case was no longer only an East Area case. It was not even only a Northern California case. The same shadow seemed to be appearing under different names in different counties, years apart. Linkage is not a matter of dramatic instinct. It is a disciplined comparison. Investigators look at entry, control, items taken, bindings, voice, movement, timing, geography, and biological evidence when it exists. They ask whether a similarity is rare enough to matter. They ask whether a difference is a true break or only adaptation. In a case this large, one wrong assumption can make the map lie. That is why the old labels survived. East Area Rapist and original Night Stalker were not just nicknames. They were containers for partial knowledge. Each container helped police talk about a cluster. Each container also risked keeping the clusters apart. The Southern California murders brought another problem: linkage. If investigators could connect the crimes, they might understand the offender's range. If they could not, each county might hold a portion of the truth without knowing it. That is why old series cases are so difficult. The evidence can be real in every file and still fail to assemble itself into one picture. The Murder Admissions later gave the case its legal architecture, but the series had already damaged far more people than the murder counts alone could show. Survivors of the attacks, families of the dead, children who grew up inside altered households, neighbors who lived under warnings, and investigators who carried unsolved files for decades all became part of the case's long aftermath. That is why the official number can feel both enormous and incomplete. 13 murders, dozens of sexual assaults, more than 100 burglaries. 87 individual victims admitted in court documents connected to 53 scenes. A number can establish scale, but it cannot measure the years people spent waiting for a name. The names in the murder file are not just numbers attached to charges. Claude Snelling, Brian and Katie Major, Deborah Manning and Robert Offerman, Charlene and Lyman Smith, Keith and Patrice Harrington, Manuela Withoon, Cherry Domingo and Greg Sanchez, Janelle Cruz. A solved case can tempt people to move too quickly toward the offender because the offender's name provides shape. The file should not let that happen. Each victim represents a life interrupted, a family altered, and a piece of the investigation that waited years for final accountability. Cold case work often depends on evidence that outlives the confidence of the original investigation. Boxes are moved, labels age, seals are checked. A sample collected for one kind of testing may later become useful for a method no one could imagine at the time. That is why chain of custody, storage, and old lab discipline matter so much. They are not clerical details. They are the bridge between an old scene and a future courtroom. In the Golden State Killer case, DNA eventually became the bridge. But DNA is not magic. It requires a sample, preservation, comparison, interpretation, and legal handling. If the evidence had been lost, contaminated, mislabeled, or discarded as useless, the future would have had nothing to read. The physical evidence waited too. That is one of the most important parts of the Golden State Killer case. Old evidence did not solve the case when it was first collected because the necessary technology did not exist, but preservation mattered. A biological sample can sit through decades, through retirements, through building moves, through new lab methods, through changes in what science can ask of it. The evidence can outlive the era that collected it. The FBI's 2016 renewed public campaign shows where the case stood before the arrest. Law enforcement knew they had a prolific offender. They had DNA from multiple scenes. They had maps, patterns, survivor accounts, and a public that still remembered. Investigators also knew what the original era had lacked. DNA testing at the time of the crimes, cell phones, neighborhood surveillance cameras, and in some areas, even the modern 911 infrastructure people now take for granted. That is not an excuse for every missed connection. It is an investigative reality. A crime series that might now produce camera footage, cell tower data, license plate readers, rapid DNA comparison, and shared databases had once depended on witness memory. Paper reports, dispatch logs, shoe impressions, sketches, and the patience of detectives trying to keep patterns alive. By then, the case no longer belonged to one office. Detectives checking old leads, lab personnel protecting evidence, prosecutors weighing the survival of old charges, survivors and families keeping memory alive, and writers who kept public attention from fading, were all holding different pieces of the same unfinished map. That mixture mattered because a cold case can fail when one part of the chain goes missing. Evidence sits silent without investigators. Investigators circle old suspects without preserved samples. Public interest turns into rumor when it outruns facts. Survivors can carry memory for years without a legal path to accountability. The Golden State Killer case eventually needed those pieces to meet at the same time. For years, the case lived in that space between known and unknown. Detectives retired, survivors aged. Families carried dates that did not fade. Journalists and researchers kept returning to the file. Michelle McNamara's work helped keep public attention on the case and popularize the Golden State Killer name. But the arrest should not be reduced to a book or a nickname. It came from evidence, police work, laboratory work, genealogy, and the persistence of people who refused to let the file become only a legend. Traditional DNA searching asks whether a known profile matches a sample. Investigative genetic genealogy asks a different question. Who is related to the unknown person who left this DNA? That shift is enormous. It turns an unknown suspect into a family tree problem. It asks investigators to move through distant relatives, historical records, marriages, ages, geography, and exclusions until the possible branches narrow. The method is powerful because offenders inherit DNA they cannot edit. It is also delicate because relatives did not commit the crime. Their information can become part of the path, but the suspect still has to be identified and confirmed through proper evidence. Genealogy can create a lead. It does not replace proof. Then the investigative question changed. Instead of asking the public to name a suspicious man from the 1970s, investigators could ask the DNA to lead them outward through relatives. Investigative genetic genealogy does not begin like an ordinary suspect lineup. It begins with a profile, distant matches, family trees, birth records, marriages, ages, geography, and patient exclusion. The suspect does not appear first. The branches appear first. That is why the genealogy chart is the second map in this case. The first map is California: towns, counties, attack locations, police jurisdictions. The second map is family: relatives, shared DNA, generations, surnames, and the slow narrowing of possibility. A detective looking at that chart is not only asking who matches the sample. He is asking who in this family tree could have been the right age, in the right place, with the right history. That narrowing process was the point at which the old case entered the modern world. A profile from decades-old crime scene evidence was compared through genealogy. Investigators built outward and then back inward, eliminating people who did not fit age, sex, geography, or history. The old question, who was this man, became a series of smaller questions that records could answer. Was there a male in the right family line? Was he old enough? Was he in California during the right years? Did his life intersect the places on the first map? Did his background make investigative sense? The chart did not shout the answer. It reduced the number of wrong answers. Investigative genetic genealogy identified Joseph James DeAngelo in 2018. That sentence is clean now, almost too clean. It hides the work behind it, the crime scene DNA that survived, the lab profile, the genealogy search, the family tree construction, the narrowing to one man, and then the need to confirm that the paper trail had truly led to the person who left the evidence. Confirmation mattered. Genealogy could point toward a branch of a family tree, but investigators still needed DeAngelo's own DNA. The confirmation came through small, ordinary objects rather than anything cinematic. Court records later described investigators collecting DNA from the driver's side door handle of his car while he was parked at a Hobby Lobby in Roseville. Then, obtaining another sample from a tissue in his curbside trash. Both samples brought the old biological evidence, the genealogy chart, and the surveillance work into the same narrow frame. That kind of detail is why the arrest feels so strange on the page. The file had been loud for decades. Headlines, warnings, hearings, public fear, survivor statements, and detective frustration. And then the final confirmation passed through a car door handle and a discarded tissue. The distance between the public image of the offender and the ordinary objects that caught him is almost impossible to measure. Investigators have to distrust theatrical thinking. A person who commits extraordinary crimes may still shop, work, raise a family, speak to neighbors, and let routine help him disappear. The absence of a monster's appearance is not evidence of innocence. The arrest in April 2018 did not happen in a dramatic lair. DeAngelo was an older man at an ordinary Sacramento area home, a former police officer, a retiree, a neighbor. Later accounts report that when officers moved in, he was worried about a roast left in the oven. That detail does not make the case smaller. It makes the ending colder. One of California's longest-running crime files closed around a man in the middle of a normal evening. Before that revelation, investigators had long wondered whether the offender understood police habits. He appeared to know when to move, how to reduce witnesses, how to control a scene, and how to avoid leaving the kind of mistake that would identify him. Some of that could come from experience as an offender. Some of it could come from reading the newspapers and learning what police were saying. But after DeAngelo's arrest, his law enforcement background gave old questions a new shape. It would be too simple to say that police training explains everything. It does not. But it helps explain why investigators and the public reacted so strongly. A former officer knew how reports were written, how patrols moved, how calls were handled, and how evidence could become weak when the scene was confused. Even if he did not use formal police knowledge in every crime, the possibility changed how people read the past. His background as a police officer gave the case a harder edge. DeAngelo had worked for the Exeter Police Department and later the Auburn Police Department. Prosecutors later said his crimes began while he was working as a police officer and continued after he was fired from Auburn in 1979. For investigators, that history mattered because it gave a possible explanation for discipline, police awareness, and confidence around procedures. It also sharpened the betrayal. The public expects police knowledge to protect communities, not help someone exploit them. The arrest did not erase the decades before it. Survivors still had to hear his name in court. Families still had to sit with the knowledge that the man had lived for decades after the crimes. Investigators still had to turn an arrest into a prosecutable ending across multiple counties. A solved identification is not the same as a completed case. A case of this size does not become simple just because the suspect is found. Prosecutors had to account for different counties, different years, different statutes, different surviving witnesses, and crimes that could no longer be charged in the same way because time had passed. They also had to consider the burden on survivors and families, many of whom had already waited most of a lifetime. The plea agreement was therefore more than a procedural shortcut. It was a way to put admissions on the record, avoid a trial that could last years, and give victims and families a chance to speak while DeAngelo was still alive. Some people wanted the full public trial that had been delayed for decades. Others needed the certainty of an ending. Both reactions make sense inside a case that had taken so much time already. The prosecution was enormous. Multiple district attorneys' offices worked together. In 2020, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and admitted many other crimes. Contra Costa County's sentencing release stated that he admitted crimes against 87 individual victims at 53 separate crime scenes. The scope of the court process revealed what the old labels had only suggested. This was not one community's nightmare. It was a statewide file built from separate nightmares that eventually had to speak in one courtroom. A trial would have had to carry old evidence into a modern courtroom. Witness memories had aged. Some witnesses were gone. Physical evidence would have needed careful explanations. Different counties would have brought different histories. The public might imagine one massive trial as a clean, final confrontation, but prosecutors had to ask what such a trial would cost the people who had already waited so long. The plea did not give every answer. It did not explain every decision DeAngelo made, every break in the timeline, or every uncharged suspicion. But it forced admissions into the record and made sentencing possible. In an old case, that kind of legal certainty has weight. The plea mattered for practical reasons. Many crimes were outside the statute of limitations. Many victims and witnesses were older. Some key witnesses had died. A full trial could have taken years and forced survivors and families through another long process. The plea gave the court something that had been missing for decades: admissions from the man the evidence had finally named. In court, the scale of the case became human again. For years, the public had known numbers: homicides, rapes, burglaries, counties, crime scenes. Numbers are useful to investigators because they show scope. They are not enough for the people who lived inside the aftermath. Victim impact statements changed the center of the room. The offender's name was no longer the only name being spoken. That is an important corrective in a case famous for its offender label: Golden State Killer, East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker. Those names describe what the public feared. The courtroom returned attention to those who survived, those who died, and those who waited through decades of uncertainty. The sentencing hearing was not only a legal ending, it was a public return of voice. Survivors and families spoke in court after years of being reduced by the case to victims, attack numbers, locations, or entries in a pattern. For an investigator, that part matters. The file can become mechanical if you let it. Case numbers, crime scenes, biological evidence, family trees, plea counts. But the reason the work mattered was sitting in that courtroom. DeAngelo was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The legal file reached an ending that older investigators had once hoped for without knowing whether they would live to see it. The name finally arrived at the end of the map. It also should not be told as if the arrest erased the failures. The case exposed weaknesses in jurisdictional communication, pattern recognition, technology, and public safety. It showed how an offender could exploit suburban trust and the limits of his era. It showed how long evidence may need to wait before the right method arrives. The lesson is not that old investigators were blind and modern investigators are brilliant. The better lesson is harder. Every era investigates with the tools it has, and some offenders survive because the missing tool has not yet been invented. Still, the Golden State Killer case should not be told as if science simply solved what people could not. That would be too neat. Science gave investigators a new route, but people preserved evidence, reopened files, built timelines, compared reports, checked family trees, collected confirmation, DNA, coordinated across counties, and carried the case through court. The solution was technological, but it was also human persistence. For investigators, the debate is practical as well as ethical. Genetic genealogy can turn a cold case into a living investigation. It can clear the innocent. It can identify people who would never have appeared in a normal suspect pool. But the method also touches families who are not suspects, and it asks society how much genetic privacy should bend when violent crimes remain unsolved. The Golden State Killer case became a landmark because the result was so powerful. A man linked to one of California's most notorious crime series had been identified after more than 40 years. That success made the method difficult to ignore. It also made the questions around it impossible to avoid. It also opened a national debate. Investigative genetic genealogy changed cold case work. It gave police a way to identify suspects in cases that had seemed almost unreachable. It also raised questions about genetic privacy, consent, database access, and how far law enforcement should go when searching through family connections. The Golden State Killer case became a proof of concept and a warning bell at the same time. That debate belongs in the story because it is part of the case's afterlife. A method that can find a serial killer can also reshape what people believe they are sharing when they upload DNA. A distant relative's profile can become part of an investigation without that relative ever imagining such a use. For victims and families, the method can feel like justice arriving late. For privacy advocates, it raises questions that cannot be dismissed. The case did not end the debate. It started a larger one. There is another reason the labels matter. Each label changed how the public imagined the offender. The ransacker sounded like a burglar. The East Area Rapist sounded like a regional sexual predator. The original Night Stalker sounded like a Southern California murderer. The Golden State Killer finally named the statewide scope. The offender did not change because the labels changed. The investigation's understanding changed. That is one of the hardest things about long, serial cases. The public name often follows the evidence late. By the time a label becomes accurate, people have already suffered under earlier labels that were too small. When I look back at the old map, the first thing I notice is how many names were needed before the final name appeared. Visalia Ransacker, East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker, Golden State Killer. Those names were not just media labels. They were stages of incomplete knowledge. Each one held a piece of the man, and none of them held enough. The second map, the genealogy chart, works differently. It does not begin with fear. It begins with relationship, cousins, ancestors, birth dates, branches, exclusions, and the slow narrowing of a human tree. In the end, the path to a man who hid behind masks and darkness ran through family lines he could not control. For an investigator, that future is not abstract. It has a texture, an old sample re-examined, a database search, a distant match, a family tree with names crossed out, public records checked against age and residence, and surveillance used not as theater but as confirmation. Each step reduces uncertainty. None of them works alone. The old case had always been full of movement, a man moving through backyards, county lines, and decades. The final investigation moved differently. It moved through records, relatives, and probability, until the suspect pool narrowed to a man who could be tested directly. That is the cold lesson of the case. What made him so hard to catch was not one trick. It was the way he exploited ordinary limits. County lines, slow paperwork, separated case names, old technology, and a world in which evidence could not yet speak across decades. He lived long enough to believe the past had stayed behind him. Then science learned to ask the evidence a question he could not control. There are still smaller questions the file cannot fully answer. How many early incidents belong to him with certainty? How many prowling or burglary reports were practice, and how many were unrelated fear? What did he learn from police work, and what did he learn from committing crimes? Why did the known series stop after 1986? Did age, risk, family life, technology, or impulse choice change his behavior? The court answered guilt. It did not answer every historical question. That is why this case still matters even after conviction. It is solved, but it is not exhausted. It remains a study of escalation, offender adaptation, investigative limitation, survivor endurance, and the sudden arrival of a future technology into an old file. There is no mystery now about the name the court accepted. Joseph James DeAngelo will spend the rest of his life in prison. But the file still deserves slow reading, because it shows how long justice can take when a case is too large for its era, and how many people must keep faith with evidence before evidence can finally speak. On the desk, the old California map and the genealogy chart do not look alike. One is made of roads, counties, and crime scenes. The other is made of families, birth records, and distant genetic matches. For 40 years, the first map could not reach the answer. Then the second map found a route the killer had never imagined. That is where I would close the folder, not because the harm is closed, and not because the years are repaired, but because the investigation finally did what every cold file asks to do. It carried the evidence forward until the future became strong enough to read it.